Are you tired of having to manually update the URLs of your microservices whenever an instance changes or scales? Well, Service Discovery offers a dynamic solution for this, and in this video we're going to explore how you can implement Service Discovery in a .NET application, so let's dive in. So I'm going to start with a simple setup with two API services. There is the first API service and the second API service, and we also have a reverse proxy sitting in front of our services and proxying the request to the API instances. Now what you're seeing here is the second API service that is actually exposing some functionality. And this functionality is just the default weather forecast endpoint, and that's all we have in this service. Now in the second API service, we are essentially implementing communication between our two microservices using an HTTP client. So I'm configuring a named client called weather with a URI hard-coded to the address of the second service, which you can see here. And then I'm exposing the same API endpoint because this is just an example, but inside of this endpoint, I'm instantiating my HTTP client and using it to send a request to the service that's going to give me back the weather forecast, and then I'm returning that as a result. So this is just a simple approach to implement network communication between my two services. And then in the reverse proxy, I'm just configuring YARP, which stands for yet another reverse proxy, and mapping the reverse proxy endpoints. And the setup is very simple. I just have one cluster, which is the downstream service where I'm proxying the requests to, and this is pointing to the first API service, which is going to send a network request to the second API service. So if I send a request to the proxy, we're going to touch all of the services that we have here. Now in the routes, I'm just configuring a catch-all route to just send a request directly to the first API service. So let's test this out, and then we're going to discuss service discovery. So I'm going to open up a split screen where I have my API request in Postman, and we're going to send this request to the first API service. And you can see I get a response back pretty quickly. But let's check out the logs to see what is actually happening here. So I'm first sending a GET request to this endpoint, and then what's going to happen inside is we're going to instantiate our HTTP client and send a request to the localhost 5161 port, which is our second API service. And this is going to give us back the response that we're going to return from this endpoint. So if I send this request a few more times, you can see that this is working as expected. Now, if I open up the logs for my reverse proxy and send a request to the URL where I'm exposing my reverse proxy, which is this URL here, then you're going to see that we are proxying or forwarding the request to our downstream service, which is the first API service running on this port. So our communication works as expected, but all of this is just hard-coded inside our application settings. And because of this hard coding, our setup isn't all too flexible. Now, a solution could be to move this into the application settings, but this only solves part of the problem. So let me show you how we can introduce service discovery into our application to simplify this approach even further. Now, I'm going to need to install a NuGet package. And let's open up the NuGet browser and look for Service Discovery. And the NuGet package that I want to install is Microsoft Extensions Service Discovery. So I'm just adding this to the first API service. And what this will allow me to do is to assign a logical name to my service. So instead of hard coding the URL, I can say HTTP and then second, and this is going to point to my second API service. Now, I also have to enroll my HTTP client in Service Discovery by calling add Service Discovery. And of course, I need to add the Service Discovery services. So let's go ahead and say Builder Services, add Service Discovery. Now, if you want to, you can enable Service Discovery for all of your HTTP clients by calling the configure HTTP client defaults method. And you can provide a delegate here where you can set the global options that you want to enable, and one of those can be add service discovery. So these are the two approaches that you can take. Let's leave this in place because they won't conflict with each other. Now, the second component that we need is the actual setup for service discovery. This NuGet package actually came out of the effort for implementing .NET Aspire, so Aspire is to blame for having cool features like service discovery built into .NET. For the time being, the service discovery support is still configuration based, but the implementation is pretty simple. I just need to define a services section, and the service discovery implementation is able to read from this section, and it's looking for a service that is called second, because this is the logical name that I use for my downstream service. So here I can define the individual endpoints, and the HTTP address is going to be this address that was hard-coded earlier. So now we move this into our application settings, and we can further manage this with a configuration manager like Azure App Configuration that we can update inside of our CI/CD pipelines instead of having to hard-code it like this in the app settings JSON. So with this in place, I want to show you one more thing that you can do, and that is defining a preference for which protocol you want to use. So let's say instead of just using HTTP, I also want to enable HTTPS if it's available. Now what's going to happen here is Service Discovery is going to look for an HTTPS endpoint, which it won't find, and then is going to default to the HTTP endpoint. So let me show you how this works. So I'm going to send a request to the first API service from Postman, and you can see the request going out here, and this time the logs are a bit different. First of all, there is a logical handler that's introduced inside of our HTTP request, and is going to try to process the GET request to this URL. It's HTTPS plus HTTP, and then the logical name of our service, and then weather forecast. And this is going to resolve the actual address of the service, which is this address here, and then append the address of the endpoint that we are calling. So you can see that our service discovery support is working as expected, and we are able to get back a response. So that takes care of our service, but what about the reverse proxy? Well, luckily, there is also support for service discovery for the YARP reverse proxy, although the setup is a bit different. So I have to install a NuGet package, and this time I'm going to look for YARP Service Discovery. And the package I want to install is Microsoft Extensions Service Discovery YARP. So let's go ahead and add this NuGet package. And then inside of the program file of the YARP application, I'm going to add an additional call to add Service Discovery Destination Resolver. Of course, for this to work, I also need to configure the Service Discovery base services by adding builder services add service discovery. And then I just need to update my application settings to reference the logical name for my service. So I can also say I want to prefer using HTTPS and then HTTP, and then the address of my service is going to be first. And because service discovery is still configuration based, I have to define a services section, add the name of my service, which is first, and then define the protocol that I want to support. So this is going to be just HTTP. And now I can start my application again. So now I'm going to send a request to the reverse proxy from Postman. And you can see that we are getting a request to the proxy endpoint. And then we are executing the endpoint that we have configured inside of our routes. And this is going to send a proxy request to the first API service, and this is using service discovery to resolve the service address. So this is how you can implement service discovery on your reverse proxy. And now I want to show you how we can simplify all of this even further by using .NET Aspire. So I'm going to create a source folder, and I will move my free API projects inside of it. And then I'm going to right-click on each project and say add .NET Aspire Orchestrator support. And the first time I do this, this is going to create the Aspire App Host project and the Service Defaults project. And then let's enroll the second API project in Aspire Orchestrator support. This is going to give me a prompt that I'm going to accept. And lastly, let's enroll the reverse proxy in .NET Aspire Orchestrator support. And now if I open up the app host, you can see that I have my free services here. So I'm just going to update the logical names for my services to first and second, because these are the names that I'm using in my service discovery configurations. So now I will go ahead and update the application settings here, and I'm going to comment out the configuration for service discovery. I'm going to do the same in the reverse proxy. So let's open up the application settings and let's comment this out. So now I just have the base service discovery setup. But because we introduced Aspire, this added some service defaults that will make it easier for us to run our applications in the cloud. And one of those defaults is configuring service discovery and also enabling service discovery for your HTTP clients. So now I can omit the service discovery setup that I manually added in my two program files, but this isn't necessary. Now, one more thing that Aspire is going to introduce is support for distributed tracing, and you're going to see how we will use this. Now, for the service discovery to actually work, I need to assign a few references between my resources. So let's name this the first API, and I'm going to give the second project a variable that I will call the second API. And what we need to do is to first define the second API so that I can reference it from the first API because it needs to be able to discover the address of that application. And the reverse proxy needs to know the address of the first API because it's going to be proxying its request to the first API using service discovery. So with this setup in place, let's go ahead and start the Aspire application. And this is going to give us the Aspire dashboard where I want to show you the details of the first API. And here you can see what are some of the configurations that are applied by default. Now I'm interested in the environment variables, and at the bottom you can see the services second HTTP and HTTPS environment variables, and these actually point to the URLs of my second API. And if I check out the settings for the reverse proxy and I scroll to the bottom of the environment variable section, you can see that I have configurations for the URLs of the first API. Now let's go into Postman, and from here I'm going to send a request to the reverse proxy, and you can see that we get a response back. And I'm going to send a request directly to the first API, and you can see that we are still getting a response, which means our communication is working as expected. But we can actually confirm this by going into the Traces tab on the Aspire dashboard, where we can see the distributed traces between our services. So here you can see the requests that we send directly to the reverse proxy. And if I go into the trace, I can see that I'm sending a request to YARP, which is being proxied to the weather forecast endpoint on the first API, and this is sending a request to the weather forecast endpoint on the second API. So you can follow the entire flow of the request from the reverse proxy to the first service to the second service. And if I go back to the traces and check out these traces here, then you can see that we have a request landing on the first API, which is being sent to the weather forecast endpoint on our second API. And you can even check out the URL in the individual span. And if I check out the last span here, this is us processing the request from the second API directly. So essentially we have one span for the request landing on the second API, one span for the HTTP request being sent from the first API to the second API, and then one span that's actually the processing of the API request on the first API. And the best part about all of this is that service discovery is also going to work when you deploy your application using .NET Aspire. Our free applications will be deployed using Azure Container Apps that natively support service discovery, and during the deployment we will be able to grab the endpoints for our services and set these values in the appropriate environment variables. And what's also really interesting about Azure Container Apps is that you can make your services internal or private. What I mean by this is that our free services will be running in a Container Apps environment, which is like a private virtual network. And if we want our services to be available outside of this network, we have to expose them by calling with external HTTP endpoints. And let's say we want to do this only on the reverse proxy, because this is what should be available to the public, and we can keep our two APIs internal to the Container Apps environment and they won't be accessible to the public. Now I'm going to tackle deployment in a future video, but I think this whole setup with service discovery and easy deployment to Azure Container Apps is very powerful. And although I like the service discovery setup in .NET, it's not a fully fledged service discovery with a service registry. A complete service discovery solution is going to include a service registry service, and one of those is HashiCorp Consul. And this is what the service discovery flow looks like. You have your microservice, let's say the ordering service, and when the service starts, it's going to register itself or register its address with the service registry. And let's say that this is HashiCorp Consul. And then when our client application wants to send a request to the ordering service, is going to use a logical name, but it first has to do a service lookup inside of the service registry. And then it's able to send a downstream request because it's able to resolve the physical URL of our service. So this is a more complicated approach than what we have in .NET because we have another service. And if you don't want to do this, the configuration-based approach may just be enough. But if you want to learn how to implement service discovery using Consul, then you should watch this video next. Make sure to smash the like button if you enjoyed this video. Check out my courses to improve your skills, and until next time, stay awesome.